los contratos que se van a firmar en el marco de la ley y de la Constitución serán muy positivos para ambas partes. Será ganar-ganar. Gana Venezuela y gana Chevron y gana el mundo. Porque ustedes tienen que acordar conmigo que la idea de sacar a Venezuela del circuito energético del mundo fue una mala idea, extremista idea de Donald Trump, y la están pagando.
The Biden administration eases some sanctions on Caracas, allowing oil giant Chevron to start producing and shipping Venezuelan oil to the United States. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Chevron, the second largest U.S. oil company, is expected to begin shipping oil from Venezuela to the United States later this month, following the Biden administration's decision to ease some of the sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan government. The U.S. Treasury Department announced late last month that it will grant the California-based company a license to pump Venezuelan oil in joint operations with the country's state-run oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA. The 6-month license authorizes Chevron to resume, quote, limited energy production and generate oil revenues from Venezuela for the first time since sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration. Venezuela has the largest petroleum reserves in the world, with its shale oil 18.2% of the world's total reserves. In comparison, the U.S., which is currently the largest producer of crude oil, has 2.1%, and Saudi Arabia 16.2% of world reserves. Since 2019, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on the entire Venezuelan government, including a measure that prevents Venezuela from trading its oil on the U.S. market, which used to be its largest outlet. So is the U.S. setting a new policy for Venezuela? And why the sudden change in direction? Joining me now from Caracas to discuss all this is Philip Gunson, a writer and consultant on Venezuela and Latin America at the Crisis Group. Phil Gunson, how is this latest move by the U.S. administration to ease some sanctions on Venezuela being received by the government there, and how is it being perceived by the Venezuelans themselves?
Well, as far as the government's concerned, I think it's fair to say it's a mixed reaction. On the one hand, they seem to be very happy with the oil deal. At least they haven't complained about it. In terms of the agreement overall, I mean, what they have said is that they're negotiating with an extremist faction of the opposition who are terrorists and coup mongers, and that the deal amounts to a surrender by the most extreme faction of the opposition. A lot of this, of course, is rhetoric and propaganda.
To what extent do Venezuelans see this as an opportunistic U.S. policy, the U.S. essentially knocking at their door because of surging oil prices?
Yes, I think you have to make the distinction between the government and the people, obviously. I mean, generally speaking, Venezuelans are not paying a great deal of attention to this, it has to be said. I think on the whole, Venezuelans of all political tendencies have rather lost faith in politics. They've lost faith in the government's ability to solve their problems, and they certainly don't have much faith in the opposition's ability to solve their problems. So they're not really, they don't have a lot of optimism that this agreement or anything that's likely to emerge from these talks will, make their lives better. The government, I think, is quietly happy, and in some regards, is celebrating the deal, and they do see it clearly as opportunism. I think they regard the US as entirely self-interested in this. They think the US is trying to get its hands on Venezuelan oil, and that's where they're coming from in terms of at least in terms of their rhetoric.
It's difficult not to be a little bit cynical, though, looking at this from the outside. The CEO of Chevron said recently that we've been trying to hang in there for a better day, as he called it, in Venezuela, to be part of, quote, building a better future. That's really what the opportunity is there. But is this what it's really all about, or is it all about securing America's financial and energy interests first and foremost?
Well, underlying this, of course, is a very severe political crisis that's been going on in one form or another for a couple of decades, as the government here has become more and more authoritarian. So, I mean, people will remember probably that back in 2019, President Trump instituted this, what he called the maximum pressure policy. This is massive sanctions and diplomatic isolation and so on. This has not really worked. And so on the one hand, the US government is trying to take a different approach, trying to encourage Maduro to gradually reinstate, a more democratic system. And in return for that, grant sanctions relief and hopefully in the end lift all sanctions. But of course, you're absolutely right. The energy crisis, the global energy crisis, is a major factor in all of this. And to some extent, it's what's driving Washington's need to negotiate directly with the Maduro government.
And so is this a major victory for Maduro? Because as you say, President Trump back in 2019 signed an executive order saying that the US essentially recognized the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela. Now it is forced to deal directly and indirectly with Maduro's government. Is it an implicit recognition of his government?
Of course, the US government still recognizes Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela, despite the fact that it's dealing with the man who actually occupies the presidential palace. What the government here says is that this deal amounts to a surrender by the so-called interim government, recognized by the US and one or two of its allies. I think that's the trend, that's the way, the direction in which things are going. But at the same time, Maduro is committed, in theory at least, to moving from this oil agreement, from this partial lifting of sanctions, from a humanitarian agreement that they've signed with the opposition, to actually making some concessions on the political front. And that's the big question mark at the moment. I mean, will Maduro actually make these concessions, or will he just spin things out as he has done in the past?
To what extent is he likely to make these concessions? Because he did say recently, quote, "We are going to dialogue because we want free elections in Venezuela, free of sanctions," he says, free of unilateral coercive measures. Of course, Venezuela was already facing a severe economic crisis before the US imposed those sweeping sanctions. But we also know that the impact has been most severe on the people of Venezuela. So many of them have simply fled the country. The government is still standing. To what extent have these sanctions, in addition to the economic mismanagement and corruption and repression, to what extent have they contributed to making a bad situation much worse?
They have made a bad situation worse. It's undeniable, because Venezuela has always based its economy primarily around the oil industry, as everybody knows. And what the sanctions do is they prevent Venezuela from selling its oil in the normal way on the international market. And they also prevent Venezuela from using the international financial system in the normal way. So, of course, it's very difficult to trade. What Venezuela is having to do right now, admittedly, of course, as you say, from a very low base, because the oil industry has been wrecked by years of mismanagement and corruption. But the oil that they are producing, what they're having to do with it is selling it at a huge discount and through very irregular means, through intermediaries and so on. So the amount of money that's coming into the country from oil and from other products as well, it must be said, is not sufficient to maintain a country of nearly 30 million people.
And Venezuela's oil sector, as you mentioned, has suffered under these punishing sanctions for several years now. The US, at the same time, is now desperately looking to stabilize oil markets, it would seem. How far will Venezuela go in trying to please Washington in return for a normalization of relations and the lifting of sanctions?
Well, I think you put your finger on the big question. The answer is we really don't know. We don't know whether there's any political will on the part of the Maduro government to agree to even partially free and fair elections, the presidential elections that are coming up and legislative elections due in 2025. That we have yet to see. There hasn't been any move by the Maduro government to make these concessions just yet. And it may be too soon, in the sense that I think what Maduro is calculating is he's willing to move, let's say, a little way down the road to a more democratic political system, provided the opposition is so weak and divided that they don't really threaten his grip on power. But if the opposition gets its act together, he's likely to pull back from that. Right now, we're far enough away from the elections that he may not want to show his hand. And that, I suspect, is going to lead to some delays in the negotiating process. It's likely we won't see another negotiating round very soon. And when we do, it's possible that there won't be anything in the way of really substantive, there certainly won't be a breakthrough, but we may not see really substantive moves of the kind that the US is demanding.
And Venezuela is one of Russia's closest allies in Latin America. Is Caracas ready to re-establish relations with Washington if it alienates Moscow? Just how important does Russia remain for Venezuela?
It's a hard question to answer. I mean, in a way, Russia has been very important, as you say, in recent times, as has China, as has Iran. These are close allies of Venezuela. They're all looking, obviously, very closely at this set of negotiations to see if Venezuela, in a sense, returns to the US sphere of influence. Maduro has given no indication that he's willing to do that, but certainly he would like direct, full relations with the United States, and he would like to deal with these issues directly with the US and not through the sort of intermediary, as he would see it, of the so-called interim government. So he's really engaging in these talks in Mexico City as a kind of proxy fashion for direct negotiations with the US. He doesn't really believe that the Venezuelan opposition, as represented at the talks, is a valid interlocutor.
Phil Gunson of the International Crisis Group joining me from Caracas. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And on the sanctions relief for Venezuela, why is it that President Biden would rather let U.S. companies drill for oil in Venezuela than here in the U.S.?
That's not an accurate take on the president's view.
Earlier this month, he said no more drilling. There is no more drilling.
The president has issued 9,000 permits for drilling on U.S. federal lands, Peter, 9,000 of them being unused. There are plenty of opportunities for oil and gas companies to drill here in the United States. I'll let Chevron speak for this particular issue of sanctions relief, but our expectation is it won't be a lot of oil coming out of there. It'll have to be shipped to the United States.
The Biden administration's decision to ease some of the sanctions imposed on Venezuela's oil sector came after the government of Nicolás Maduro resumed talks with the opposition in Mexico City. Both sides signed a US-brokered social contract aimed at easing Venezuela's political stalemate and humanitarian needs. An earlier UN report estimated that $795 million would be needed to support over 5 million people in Venezuela through health, education, and other humanitarian projects.
Como hay más de 20.000 millones de dólares represados, bloqueados, injustamente apropiados por el sistema financiero, por bancos extranjeros, por sanciones groseras que violentan el orden internacional, nosotros queremos anunciar que por vía de este acuerdo estamos rescatando más de 3.000 millones de dólares que van directamente al financiamiento de educación, de salud.
7.1 million people, almost a quarter of Venezuela's population, have migrated abroad since 2015. So will this new agreement spur positive change in Venezuela and end the political crisis? And will it pave the way for a normalization of relations between Washington and Caracas? Joining me now to discuss this is Julian Cárdenas, energy law professor at the University of Houston. He sits on the ad hoc administrative board of directors of Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, the Venezuelan national oil company. Professor Cárdenas, last March, an American delegation went to Caracas to engage in talks with a government that the US administration itself doesn't recognize. Now you have this latest move with Chevron. Is there any other way to look at it, but in the context of the US trying to offset the loss of Russian oil on global energy markets? Is there any doubt that the US boycott of Russian oil and gas is what has made Washington reassess its Venezuela policy?
Well, I think there's different taking on the ease of sanctions against Venezuela and this possibility of General License 41 that allows Chevron to produce more and is the restart of negotiations in Mexico between the regime of Nicolás Maduro and the coalition of the opposition parties that support the interim government of Juan Guaidó. And I'm saying that because the production in the U.S. is rising and is enough to provide a supply to the U.S. market. And what it will come from Venezuela to the US, it will be an insignificant amount of oil that it won't affect even prices. It won't have an impact.
But if
And
that is
also,
really the case, why then this change of direction, not just now, but going back to March when there were these direct talks that took place between the Maduro government and a US delegation?
well, it has been part of the strong requests of the regime of Nicolás Maduro in terms that the establishment of negotiation, part of that was to ease sanctions at some degree that will take them back to Mexico with the opposition, which, that had been a negotiation that had also happened during the year 2022. Those negotiations were suspended last year. We have a strategic movement from both parties. Maduro accepting the reestablishment of the negotiation, and the US complying with the promise of easing some sanctions because of that movement of the Maduro's regime.
And of course, President Maduro wants it to go further. He has called for the total lifting of sanctions on the country's oil industry. He says the US measures that have been in place for a while now contravene international trade. Is the US ready, though, to turn the page with Venezuela, even if it dislikes its government because of its new energy security policy?
The oil industry in Venezuela is in such a state of destruction that this License 41 is not representing a solution for any significant increase of the production of Venezuela. So what we have
So what
here
is the key motivator then? Why is the US changing course so dramatically if it isn't going to make much of a difference?
Well, in a broad perspective, License 41 is just in the corner of many issues that are going on, because the sanctions regime still remains on its majority of measures in place for the protection of Petróleos de Venezuela assets in the United States. So this license, again, is very limited in terms of the financial resources that the Maduro regime can get from it. And it's also in terms of production, we won't have a significant impact on Venezuelan production. We are talking here about two main projects, one Petroboscan and the other one Petropiar, one heavy crude oil and the other one asphalt. And those projects won't increase significant supply in the US, and also it won't have a significant impact on the Venezuelan production.
And as you know, there are many lawmakers here in the US who have been very vocal in their opposition to engaging with the Venezuelan government. The chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Robert Menendez, said just a few months ago that the resumption of talks at the time breathed new life into what he called Maduro's reign of terror. What drives the strong opposition to Venezuela in the United States Congress today?
Well, the internal part of politics in the U.S. Also, are getting the measures, getting the criticism of why the U.S. is not boosting production or increasing production in the U.S. Instead, is buying oil from anti-U.S. governments.
As you know, there's a strong anti-Venezuela lobby here in the United States, but there's also a strong oil and gas lobby that wants to push for the resumption of relations with Venezuela to be able to tap into its energy sector. How much of this opening to Venezuela's oil sector has to do with the power and influence of the oil lobby in the US?
I think the way you put it it shows a lot the reality, what is taking place in Washington, D.C., and even in a city like Houston. That tug of war between these two groups, the groups that are arguing and claiming for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela on one side, and the others who, in the face of this international energy crisis, are looking for the reestablishment of investments in Venezuela. I think the two groups has a very tough mission because they are dealing, as I mentioned before, with a regime that has a record of violating not only contractual rights, but also human rights and international law. So this is just a very complex scenario and negotiation. What had been taking place in Mexico and Caracas with the mediation of the government of Norway is a very complex negotiation that it may take time, and we may see future agreements coming out of that negotiation if Maduro's regime decides not to continue.
To what extent, though, does all this help Venezuela in the long term? According to Open Secrets, Chevron itself ranks among the top oil and gas industry lobbying spenders, with almost $5.4 million paid to lobbyists in the first 3 quarters of 2022 alone. In fact, in 2021, Chevron's lobbying spending topped $6.7 million. How much is this to do with Chevron's bottom line? How much of it has to do with what's in the best interest of Venezuela in the long term?
Well, one of the risks of doing businesses in Venezuela, not only now, but even many years ago in the last 2 decades, is facing the risk of that conditions can change over time and can change or have changed not in a very positive way. One of the concerns of an investor, such as a company like Chevron, is that 2022 is almost reaching an end. It's a year of boom of oil prices, and the Venezuelan oil industry and all investors involved in it have lost the opportunity of producing or pumping more oil in the year where prices recover their position and were even over $100 a barrel of oil. When you compare that with the situation of Citgo Petroleum Corporation in the United States, that have multiplied almost by 4 the number of profits, it shows the two difference between the interim government of Juan Guaidó and what is suffering the regime of Nicolás Maduro. Again, one company was able to take advantage of the oil boom, whereas PDVSA in Venezuela had suffered a year that had not been able to increase production and not even reach close to the goal of that Nicolás Maduro said at the beginning of the year of producing 1 million of barrels of oil a day. They are below 700,000 barrels of oil a day, which is 20% of what Venezuela used to produce in the past.
And when you look at the geopolitical realities surrounding Venezuela, it is one of Russia's closest allies in Latin America. In fact, President Maduro assured President Putin of his strong support after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is Caracas, though, today ready to re-establish relations with Washington if it alienates Moscow?
I think on the geopolitical spectrum, a recent meeting in France that in which participated delegations from Colombia and Mexico showed the interest of many governments to try to find a solution to the political crisis in Venezuela. And of course, the reason behind it also considered the opportunities for the energy sector that exists in Venezuela. But moving forward investments in a country with such a bad record in respecting sanctity of contracts and rule of law is very critical for any investor that take the high risk to invest in a market in that type of conditions.
All right, Julian Cárdenas, energy law professor at Houston University, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In December, 100 years ago, President James Monroe articulated a new U.S. foreign policy for the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine aimed at shielding Central and South America from European colonial powers. But quickly, European colonialism was replaced by American imperial behavior. Protection of U.S. economic interests was paramount, even if it meant engineering coups, insurrections, and support of right-wing dictatorships. When Washington could not unseat governments it disliked, sanctions were the order of the day. Just look at Cuba. America's often stated goal, the promotion of democracy, has largely been a fig leaf. Venezuela, once an El Dorado of wealth and glitz in South America, is no exception. U.S. sanctions, as well as the Venezuelan government's mismanagement and corruption, have led to the country's economic downfall. But U.S. sanctions didn't bring about the downfall of the Maduro government. The decline of the U.S.-Venezuela relationship started in 1999, following the election of the leftist President Hugo Chavez, who never minced his words towards Washington, which is now, in turn, showing that it is ready to swallow its own words. Already back in March, when the war in Ukraine was in its early stages, the White House discreetly sent a delegation to Caracas to engage in talks with the Maduro government, a government it did not recognize. In short, replacing Russian oil became a priority, and the Biden administration was looking for ways to resume Venezuelan oil imports. Trump's push for regime change in Caracas had failed. Biden, thanks largely to the war in Ukraine, realized that political pragmatism was necessary and heeded the adage, when you're in a hole, stop digging. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.